So I'm going to begin the recording. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Biomimicry webinar series on Biomimicry Switzerland. Today we're going to be discussing the design for life, how to apply life principles to your product, process, and solution. Biomimicry Switzerland, a few words about Biomimicry Switzerland. We're an association based in Switzerland that our main goal is to really enable the meme of biomimicry to be spread out across Switzerland and Europe. We are really all about making sure people understand what biomimicry is and how it could be used in different elements of society, whether it's in actually creating a product or even embedding it into an organization or potentially even a structure. So today we're going to be covering the life principles. So the format is we're going to go through some content. I have another colleague that will also join us. I don't know if she has joined us yet.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. So Catherine is hello. Catherine is also going to be the speaker today with myself. So we'll be covering a number of introductory slides about biomimicry, and then we'll jump into the essence of this discussion today, which is the life principle, and we'll explain what it is. So let me get started. So what we wanted to kind of start first with what's biomimicry. I know some of you didn't attend our introductory webinar a couple of weeks ago, but I figured we just give you some really big, simple kind of understanding of what it is. So it is a practice on how to apply lessons from nature. And as you probably all know, nature or life has all kinds of unique ways to be adaptable to the changing condition on the earth, right? So all the organisms we see today have adapted over millions of years, and they do it in a healthy and sustainable way. So that's what really the practice of biomimicry is how do we look into this knowledge from nature and how do we tap this biology and translate it into other means for humans' benefits. So biomimicry designers really focus mostly on this idea of learning from nature and emulating nature, right? We're looking at not copying nature, but looking at how does organisms able to achieve these amazing adaptations and learn those strategies and mechanisms, and then potentially adapt those principles into product or design or systems. So while you do that, you have to have good intention, right? You're doing this intentionally, or you're learning from nature with a sense of, I'm doing this because nature is a good model for us. It's been around longer than humans. You're doing this by this process of emulation, which is really applying the insights of what living things have been doing over millions of years and how it could be adapted to human challenges that we have. And we also have to have this kind of idea of humility for all life on Earth, right? As you will learn today and continue this journey with us, there's so much that we don't know about the biology. I mean, when we understand it, we realize that there's so many ways nature does things that are very different than humans in such a manner that it is sometimes really a full respect for what nature could really do in terms of creating these amazing materials using basic materials and so on. So when we look at sustainability, which is something that we all know, and it's no longer just a nice to have, it's a must to have. For the longest time, since the late 60s, we've looked at ways to reduce the impact, right? So think of it as catalytic are great for to reduce the pollution, but it's not really embedding pollution. What we're looking at all the time is what we're looking over time is finding ways that we could not only restore but move towards a regenerative design, where whatever we're doing actually will have an impact over time. And that's what biomimicry is about. It's really those amazing breakthrough technologies that could really change the way we operate as a community. We cannot mention biomimicry without talking about sort of like the godmother of this space. She is a fantastic writer. a researcher. This book that she wrote, Innovation Inspired by Nature, is almost more than 20 years. Janine Benyus is really the reference for biomimicry. She's the one who kind of brought back this perspective of how can we learn from nature, right? So it's not like we've never done it before. We've done it all along. All the time humans have been on Earth, we've observed nature. If you look at Leonardo da Vinci or even other great inventors, they all seek out answers from nature. She actually, 20 years ago, brought a collection of these inventions and scientists and brought it to light and make it people realize that there are amazing researchers around the world that are looking in the chemistry of particular living organisms or even looking at system process in entire ecosystem. So she is an amazing speaker, and I encourage you to really look into some of the TED Talks and so on. It's also good to keep in mind that men have been incredibly genius in creating amazing things, right? So if you think about today, I mean, the reason why we're able to talk remotely in this virtual environment, it all comes down to this microchip, right? A computer chip. It's probably one of the biggest breakthrough humans has ever created, right? It's an incredible tool that allows us to do millions of things, right? From entertainment to doing computation that could solve the next potential virus or illness that could be identified using computers and so on, and discovering next materials. But if you look at what mankind I find over such a short time, nature has done it so many other ways, right? Like night visions, lightweight materials, how to regulate temperature. So we have this untapped knowledge that is really this capacity for us to look into. Now, the reality is going from biology to design is difficult, but it is an opportunity for us to look when we're faced with a challenge, how does nature solve that challenge? So it's kind of give us an opportunity to look into a new untapped resource of knowledge. When we talk about biomimicry, it's important to talk about kind of the basics of biomimicry. It's really three things, and I'm going to go through with you. Is the ethos, reconnect, and emulate. So when you practice biomimicry, you not only practice the emulate part, which most people are really excited about. It's really how you learn from biology and translate it into an actual design. But you have to look at the other two that are essential. The ethos is probably why you're all here. It's because you have a personal curiosity about biomimicry. Maybe you were exposed because you're a nature lover. You love the outdoors. You want to be a protector, steward of the earth. Maybe you have children, grandchildren that you want to make sure you pass on the same benefits that you receive as a young child. So it's a reason for us as humans to not just use nature for our own purpose, but it's how do we are collaborating with nature so that we not only are the steward of the earth, but also the ones that will help restore these ecological services. So it's really important for us to have that good intention. This is the one that I like myself the most, is the reconnect. If you're going to use biomimicry as a tool for innovation, whether you're faced with a challenge in your company for a product, process, or even a system, you cannot do it just from looking at beautiful pictures, videos, reading books. You need to go out and observe nature in this context where they live. And the idea of reconnecting is if you understand how organisms live in essentially with other organisms and how everything is interconnected, it gives you a better idea of how they're able to survive and thrive in a particular environment. So the reconnection is essential. And that's actually part of why we are human. And then the best part for most people is this idea of multidisciplinary approach when you bring different skill sets together, whether it's biologists, chemists, physicists, engineers, designers, business people coming together and say, we're faced with a systemic challenge. How can we solve it? Can we consult into nature's way? How does nature actually address this problem? And then see if there's a way to take the nature's knowledge from biology and translate it into something that could be useful for humans. And we'll give you some examples of that. When you practice biomimicry, it's important to look at what we call functional biology and strategy. Biomimicry kind of is broken into three areas. Either you look at specific shapes in nature, so nature will create a specific form to fit a specific function. We may look at process, how nature actually manufactures things. Nature has unique ways of creating proteins or enzymes that could do specific things that would create very solid, durable, flexible materials. And then nature has unique way of combining resources, of sharing resources, of providing this idea of interconnectivity with each other. And that requires communications, exchange, knowledge, but also essentially collaboration and being generous about what you have and how you could serve the others, right? So it's all about kind of this ecological balance when you look at the system elements. Is how do you make a resilient system by having resources shared by everyone? It's also important to look at when we look at biomimicry that there is this idea of scale. Scale is really essential, right? Because when you look at form, for instance, there is a specific scale. That scale that you're observing in a living organism has to be applied the same way if you're going to solve a human challenge, right? If you're taking something that has a mesoscale and then now you want to apply it at the nanoscale, it's not going to work, right? So there are things that are happening at the mesoscale. There are things that are happening at the nanoscale, like for instance, in a lot of the process, how nature creates structures and chemistry element that happens really at the nanoscale, right? Things that even 15 years, 20 years ago, we didn't even understand because we had no way to observe this. And now we're able to understand how nature is able to assemble protein to do specific things. And then we have what's called the macro scale, right? And that's usually at the larger level, if you look at a marshland and how all these systems are interconnected and how they're operating. So the idea of scale is important because it's you could not take something from the living world and apply it in different scale because in many cases it doesn't work. So how do you integrate biology into design? You have to look at the biological fitness, meaning the fitness in biology is the reproductive success and reflective of how well organisms adapt to an environment. So in a sense, if the organism is able to reproduce itself, have a lot of offspring, that means the environment where it lives is healthy enough to support that biological group, if you will. It's also important to look at the genotype. It's a set of genes in the DNA which is responsible for particular traits. But we also need to look at the phenotype, which is the physical expression of those characteristics. For instance, the skin color, height, behaviors, according to an individual makeup in genetics. The phenotype is the total characteristics displayed by the organism under a particular set environment. So what will happen, for instance, in human, you've probably seen this, humans that tend to have a darker skin tend to live in areas in the world where there's a lot more UV light or sunlight. If you look at the further north in communities like the Inuits, they tend to be much shorter humans, right, in terms of height. They're not very tall people. Again, because cold weather, you want to manage the heat loss, right? Same thing applies with animals, where depending on where you are, the phenotype and the context where you live will dictate your genetic kind of translation. This is something really interesting for us to understand because when you look at the context, you start understanding why particular animals are in specific characteristics or strategy they use to survive. So here's an example of an Namibian beetle. Has a unique characteristic. It lives in a very unique environment. So let me kind of walk you through what we talk about functional biology in a sense. So what is it? Well, it's a Namibian beetle which lives in the desert, right? So we know it's a beetle. There's many, many kinds of beetles around, but this kind actually lives in a very arid weather. Excuse me, I'm just unmuting somebody else. So what is the challenge the beetle has, right? So if you think about beetles, excuse me, if you think about beetles, they have to drink water, right? Humans, whether we're humans or whether any other creatures on the earth, live without food for probably a month, 3 weeks, but you cannot live without water for roughly 3 to 4 days. So water is essential. So capturing water in an arid climate, that's a unique challenge, right? So the strategy is, how does the beetle address this challenge? The beetle's wings covers gather water from the air using nanoscale bumps. So again, the context there, it lives actually in a desert, but the desert is actually close to some sort of a coast, right? It could be a few hundred miles, but there's still that moisture coming from the ocean. And if you just join in, please turn off your mic. Thank you. And the function here is, what does the beetle need to perform these strategies to capture liquid water, right? So it actually has evolved with this particular structure on his wings to gather the water from the air that allows it to actually drink it. And what's amazing, if you ever seen videos of a beetle, and there's many other organisms that use this, the same strategy, is that it would sit on top of a dude or kind of open its wing early in the morning, so the dew will come in and the water will just go straight into her mouth, which is really an amazing design. But again, it's a niche organism that lives in a very specific environment. So the function here is very specific. So when you look at biology and biomimicry in general, and you look at a human system, there are some interesting elements to kind of observe. Human systems tend to be more linear, right? We have a linear process, we have a linear mindset. That's changing, by the way, but this is kind of how we've worked as a society. Nature is a cyclical system. Everything gets reused, and there's no waste in nature, right? Everything gets to be breakdown and reused over time. Think about our own system, there's a lot of waste. We really bet on this idea of uniformity. That's how we can get things done to the cheapest amount of things. So we really want things that will be the same over and over. Nature banks on diversity. The more diverse the ecosystem, the more resilient it is. We look at maximization of resources. Nature looks at optimization. Whatever is the best size and weight and function to really be able to have that level of fitness. We use very energy intensive process to make things. If you start thinking about things that we use every day, requires a lot of embedded energy, carbon embedded, embodied energy. Nature uses self-assembly models. We rely on the cheapest source. Whatever is cheap we use, nature will use whatever is nearby to make things. And we're highly disposable, as you probably know this. It's even getting worse with things like plastic. Nature is biodegradable by definition, right? So that gives you a sense of how one and the other is kind of very different. I'm going to move into the design thinking. So when you practice biomimicry, you could do it in kind of two ways, if you will. You can go from a challenge, you identify a challenge. Let's say you were looking for ways to create lightweight structure. So you define the challenge. I'm looking for lightweight structure that have a particular function. It has to be lightweight. It has to be able to withstand certain types of pressures and so on. We'll be talking about the life principle the second time. I'm going to skip this. Then you look into nature. How does nature create lightweight structure? And you may find hundreds of ways, right? Like from the structure of bones in birds to all the way to bacteria and so on. And then of that, you would abstract the biology from it, which is a difficult process that will give you ideas that could be no longer biological based, but that could be strategy that we could potentially use in engineering and design. Then you'll go through a brainstorming process, and then you'll go to this emulation process of how to potentially pick those best strategy and create something out of it. And then again, you will use the life principle, which we'll talk about in a minute, on how to measure. So this is really a challenge to biology. And keep in mind that process is iterative. You could be going back and forth, and you may actually go back, one step because you've learned something over time. So it's not much different than any other design thinking model. The other one is same thing, but except of starting from a challenge, you start from biology. You discover something in biology, like for instance, the clingfish is an amazing fish that could stick to rocks, and does that because it could withstand significant tides and movement in the water. So it holds down to a surface for the time it needs, and then it could release itself, right? So it's a unique adaptation that we don't quite understand, but there's a unique biology behind that, and you could actually learn that and apply it to a solution. And then quickly, I wanted to also mention that we have different tools that we use that are from the Biomimicry Institute, which is the taxonomy. This is just a glance. When you start looking at these different functions, you can have ways on how these functions could apply to specific things that you're looking as a designer. And that's available on Ask Nature, and that's a search engine. We can talk about it at the end. So now we're going to go into what we wanted to talk about today, which is the life principles. And if you have any questions, feel free to write it in the chat. Some people will, people from the Biomimicry system will monitor that, and we'll definitely be able to cover this. So the life principle is really 6 principles that were defined and created by Janine's Benyus group several years ago. This has been many different iterations. There are 6 main principles, and there are a number of sub-principles. And today we're going to be talking about the 6th principle and some of the sub-principles. But really, in a sense, what they are, they're basically deep patterns that are kind of seen across all living things, and even humans included, that Janine and her team has identified that are pretty much, I would say 96% of all species on Earth will oblige by these rules, right? More or less, right? There are some exceptions. So we'll go to each of them in greater detail in a second. But one thing is important to say that everybody on Earth is subject to the same kind of operating conditions. Whether you're a human or a bacteria, you have potential, you have to think about sunlight, right? Either you use sunlight as a source of energy, which is really how nature is run, it's entirely on sunlight. A lot of the chemistry that's happening, whether it's in your own body right now, it's all water-based. We're all bound by gravity, which is a good thing, right? Otherwise we'll be floating in the air. Which has a lot of implications, right? They did some amazing studies around trees and how trees actually know where it's up and where it's down. I could certainly explain what they discover by doing some work in space actually with trees. And then we live in a dynamic non-equilibrium element, meaning that everything is constantly moving, right? There's not a state of one step that it always remains the same, right? It's always an evolving process. And it's a changing process, which requires feedback loops, so that you know what's changing so you can adapt. And we also live in the limits of boundaries. Not everything on Earth is not just forever, right? The air that you breathe is the same air that was there millions of years. The water you drink was in the bladders of dinosaurs millions of years ago, right? And then we live in a cyclical process, right? If you think about the moon, if you think about tides, if you think about the seasons, all that has a specific aspect. And organisms, whether it's yourself as humans or everything else, are bound by these. So let's start with evolve to survive. And just give me a second because I need to get another computer going. So evolve to survive, here's an example of crows. Maybe you've seen them. They're actually highly adaptable animals. I'm actually fascinated by crows. Some people dislike them for whatever reason. But what they've noticed with crows is that they evolve to survive in a very unique ways. They actually, some crows that are, and the crows and raven are both very unique, but there are some that have been shown to actually learn from each other. And they learn how to use specific tools. And it's not unique to crows. There's a lot of other chimps and apes do the same thing. But what's amazing is crows will use a small stick to be able to go inside a dead tree to find larvae that they could eat, right? So, but once they do that, they teach each other how to do it, right? So they evolve to survive a very unique way of doing that. And they repeat those strategies. So once you identify a strategy that is working, not only are you going to pass it on to your next generation, but you also will show others in your community to do so. And crows are actually amazing they're very social creatures. And just a little side note for you, crows at night, there's only one crow usually that is awake to let other people know if there's a trap. And they take turns, right? So not everybody is just spending the whole night awake. It will take 2 hours, 3 hours, and the next crow will go to bed, and another one wakes up to help others. Adapted to changing conditions, that's another principle that we have. These are the overarching principles. I'm a big fan of this animal. The Arctic fox have different colors depending on the season, right? In the winter, obviously, is white, so that he can easily disguise himself, right? And then in the spring, he obviously becomes more of a brownish color that kind of mixed with the surrounding environment. So again, changing conditions allows the species to really evolve to be able to be adapted to that process, right? And there's obviously a gradual process between brown to white that happens, but that's a necessary process for him to be able to survive and adapt to this unique environment, right? So it's a niche environment where he lives, and he learns how to do that over time. And if you think about it, we've done the same thing in the human world. If you think about, for some of you that remember VHS, right? If you're old enough, but now that's a relic where nobody used that anymore. And a few years ago, we were still using DVD, and that's no longer really as relevant. Now everything is either streaming or you can download it directly, right? So we also evolved to survive or adapting, we also have adapting changing conditions in the human world, because as the context changes, we actually change the behaviors and how we operate. We also use specific materials. So we are specifically resource efficient in this context of birds. They will build bird nests that are specifically made of materials nearby in whatever elements they could find to make that nest that specific fits its need. And if you look at birds, some makes these beautiful waving structures that actually helps attract a mate. But it also is has a very specific function. The size of it is very unique to the size of the animals, and even the location of where it's built is essential. There are some birds, types of bird that actually would reuse bird nests from other species over time. And I'm going to turn into Catherine, if that's what you want to cover.
Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, happy to be here. So here, this is another group of life principles. So this is be locally attuned and responsive. So what does it mean for this puffball, this mushroom? So the spore of these mushrooms are tiny, and they can be dehydrated very easily. So when raindrops fall on it and release the spore, this is a perfect condition for the spore to survive. And in that sense, the puffball is attuned and responsive to the local condition for the survival of its spore. So Jack, please, can I have the next one? Yes. So I discover another group of life principle, integrate development with growth, which means basically that strategies developed in nature will optimize the investment by incorporating development and growth with growth. And this is a physarum actually. This is neither a plant nor an animal nor mushrooms. This is called a protist, and it's actually a single creature, single-celled creature. And if you go in the forest, for example, in a rainy day, you may see it on the floor, on dead leaf or dead wood. This organism is able to move and to develop its body by contracting and expanding some kind of veins that you can see here in search of food. So typically this organism combines growth with development, and it's an extremely effective forager. It creates highly efficient networks to find food sources. So actually, scientists are actually doing many research on this kind of organism to understand better, for example, the development of neural intelligence. So Jacques, please, the next one. So the next group of the life principle, it's use life-friendly chemistry. So nature will use the chemistry that supports life, right? So the chemistry that happens in our body must not harm ourselves. So life can create toxins, but organisms have ways to disassemble or deactivate those toxins. So this beautiful butterfly makes bright blue color to attract mates. So in the dark forest, in tropical forest, for example. And actually this blue color is in an iridescent color. That's how it is called. Its name, it's not made by a pigment. but it's made by a very typical specific structure, and it's a nanoscale. So Jacques was speaking about that before. It's a nanoscale structure, and this structure is able to basically concentrate and diffuse light in a certain manner so that it creates this very bright color. So in the industry, some companies have been mimicking the structure of these butterfly wings by producing different kind of nanostructure for coloring fabrics, or even using for pens to apply on cars, for example. So this prevents the use of structural color. This prevents from using chemical pigments, which are often made of toxic elements, which generates a lot of environmental problems. So Jacques, please, that's your.
Thank you, Catherine. So we've covered kind of the 6 main principles now, and now we're going to go to some of the other sub-principles. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the life principles are used at the onset of your design process, whether you're going from biology to design, whether you go challenge to design. So they're used as a design brief. So kind of think of what are the non-negotiable things that you want to include, or basically a sort of like a potential goals that you have for your design. But they're also used as a checklist at the end of the process, right? Did you design your solution adhere to these principles, right? So now we're going to go to some of the sub-principles that are more specific, and then actually give you some ideas on how they could be applied. So here again is the actual life principles, and we're going to be covering mostly the sub-principles, which are a little bit more specifics and might give you an idea of how they are, how they're used, and how they could be used in product design, and maybe manufacturing, or even potentially how to reorganize an organization, how to work better, and how to create resiliency within an entity. So evolve to survive, incorporate the unexpected. So that's one of the sub-principles. So when we look at elephant, which basically elephants are the largest mammals on the planet, right? They're magnificent creatures. What they've actually found is the mutation of their genetic codes many millennia ago was actually a mistake, right? It was actually think of it as an error. They were supposed to have smooth skin, and they end up with this wrinkled skin, right? Which if you ever touch an elephant, that's really what it is. It's not smooth. It's got these wrinkles, and as a result of that, the elephant being such a large mass. If you think about it, if you're an elephant and you're living in Africa in the savannah, how can they survive being so massive, significant heat? But part of it is because they have this additional wrinkle on their structure, which really created exponential space, and that allows basically a greater heat dissipation. So in a way here, by mistake, this evolution went wrong, right? There was a mutation, which in this case was a good mutation because it actually allowed this particular species to survive in a unique climate. Also the fact that at that time, maybe there was a changing climate in Africa, which led to an adaptation of the species. So really this idea of unexpected, incorporated unexpected is really something to have that in mind. An idea of a product that most of you probably even heard about it, but when 3M invented Post-it, they didn't really even invent Post-it. They actually, the scientists that invented kind of what came to be Post-it was a glue that when he created the glue, they were like, it wasn't really good glue because it would stick, but not really stick things for long. And then of that mistake, they realized, well, we could use it to stick paper on things and move it around. And now, obviously, Post-it is a significant business for 3M that they never expected. It's interesting to also look at this other principle. So adapting to changing conditions, looking specifically at maintaining integrity through self-renewals. The rhino horn are a non-lining materials that is, weathering and rooting cause of wear and tear, right? So if you ever seen rhino, they look cute, but they're actually pretty aggressive animals. And they do fight. I mean, like a lot of animals. So they do fight on a regular basis, especially male. And since rhino cannot grow new horn, which is one of the reason why we have this issue right now with rhino being killed and for wildlife trafficking for whatever reason. But once they lose their horn, they're basically they don't have a new one. The horn itself must be self-repair, right? They have to find a way to fill these cracks. So once they have small cracks, there's a protein in the horn. When exposed to air or damage, it will fill in and basically filling that crack. So think of it as an actual structure that, in this case, the horn, the rhino horn, who is self-healing, right? Using this unique protein that is actually part of that process. There are a lot of things that humans are trying to do. We are looking, there are projects in Germany at creating self-healing concrete, for instance. So think about, we use concrete for so many things. Where we have catastrophic failures is because either we can notice the concrete failing and potentially allowing moisture to enter inside the concrete, which potentially could damage the metal structure inside. So they're working on self-healing structure. They're also looking at self-healing materials that can be used on other products. So again, mimicking this principle in nature, in this case, maintaining integrated true self-renewal. This one is an interesting one. When we look at embodied resilience through variation, redundancy, and decentralization. So if you think about how that works, think of how your body is able to deal with viral and bacterial attacks, right? So on an ongoing basis, your body is constantly looking for ways to protect you, right? Whether it's from a viral or a bacteria. And obviously there are good bacteria that are essential to human function, obviously, that we nurture in our own body. But obviously these attacks are unpredictable, right? We don't know when they're going to happen, right? So your immune system is really not only trained to have resiliency, but is also trained to do this in different ways, right? It doesn't have one type of white cells that will do some things. It has actually a multitude of ways to create these immunobodies that helps you protect yourself. And they're obviously replenished from your lymph nodes that are throughout your body. So again, it's a decentralized system. It's not relying on one system. It's really embodied to really be able to listen to what's surrounding is happening and allowing the fastest and the quickest response. So obviously, it is important to have, the healthier your body, the healthier is your immune system, and that's why we have a lot of challenge with people that are that might suffer either some illness or potentially are subject to not being able to have a well-trained immune system. That's why it's important for children to be exposed to viruses and bacteria so that their immune system is better. So if you think about how that would work in an airplane, for instance, an airplane is a very complex machine that has many different things. So for instance, the landing gear could be operated in many ways. It could be operated via some sort of electronic systems. It could be operated with some sort of wiring system. So what engineers have come up with, and actually in aviation is very strong, they must have at least 3 ways to operate the same thing using 3 different systems, right? So they're all independent of each other, but they could all potentially be operating over time. And that's why when you have airplane, crash, I mean, usually it's because many systems are failing all at the same time, which is quite rare in that process. So there could be electrical, mechanical, and pneumatics process happening in an airplane. And that's why it's really important to have different systems and different parts of how they operate. It's also interesting to look at this idea of having a specific form that fits a function. We just talked about this earlier about this the beetles and the bumps on it that has a specific shape that allows to have a specific outcome here. The beetle lives in a very niche environment that most beetles would not want to live, and many other organisms do not live. So they tend to live in these arid areas, but they find a way to evolve and survive because they developed a unique adaptability. In this case, it's the form on there that is a hydrophilic and hydrophobic structure that allows this ability to capture and drink water from the air, which is a unique aspect there. So you can think about it, how this is really changing to the conditions. If anybody who wears a photochromatic lens in your eyeglasses, they basically are transparent in internal ambient lights, and when they're exposed to UV lights, the molecule inside the lens will change and becomes darker, right? So we have similar ways to have a specific process that allows to change depending on the condition. We also have sorry, I'm looking for a slide. So we also have what's called multifunctional design. In this case, if you ever seen ducks, feathers have a multiple function, right? Feathers are, in this case, provide warmth, also allows them to fly. Feathers are also important for mating, right? Especially coloring, right? It attracts different males or female. And then the way, if you ever notice, ducks will do what's called preening. Not only it cleans the feathers, kind of what you're seeing on the picture here, but while they're doing that, they also spread preen oil that allows the feather to be waterproof. So they're physically cleaning themselves, right? They want to remove any kind of foreign object or elements to be able to fly and move around. But while they're doing that, they're creating this preen oil that they're coating on their feathers to allow it to be waterproof over time. But it also allows to moisturize their beak. So the function there is, to provide ways to create waterproof feathers, but while doing that, it also helps moisturize their own beak, which is also essential for them. And then in the presence of sunlight, the preen oils break down into vitamin D, which helps keep the ducks healthy, right? So you have many different functions that are one strategy that allows them to do different things over time. So, and it's quite common in nature, right? I'm sure you're at home and you're looking at around your TV, you have a remote for the TV, one for the cable box, we don't have usually one thing that does it all. I mean, this is evolving, but that's sort of the same idea here. If you think about cell phone, I mean, nowadays when we have a cell phone, is your phone a cell phone? Probably not. It's more than a cell phone. Is a cell phone, but it's also a music player, it's a camera, it's a web browser. So again, we're combining things into one functional thing. That's why, cell phones are becoming so essential to our lives. Sorry, I'm looking for the slide. So we've talked about earlier about this idea of locally attuned and responsive. One of the sub-principles is leverage cyclical process. And because the cyclical process are almost predictive, they know exactly when they happen. So maybe may not know, but this picture is actually the blooming of a saguaro cactus that actually are commonly found in the southwest of the United States. A beautiful cactus, very, very slow growing cactus. But what's interesting is that the blooming of the saguaro flowers, which are cacti flowers, coincide with the migration of the bats in both the spring and the fall. So the bats northward to follow the blooming. So when the bats are migrating from south to north, they're following the blooming of the cactus. And for the bat, they're traveling long distance, right? They're going from a warmer, an area where it's becoming less warm to a warmer location in the US. And every time they stop by a cacti and drink or go to the nectar of the plant, that's like a pit stop for them. That's how they get food, right? And in doing that, they're helping the saguaro be able to spread their pollination process. And the same thing happens, obviously, when they're migrating southward again. So it's a really essential process. So leveraging cyclical elements is essential. There's a company called Biopower, who there's several of those now. They're taking advantage of tidal, so the movement of water that are coming in and out, tidal waves or tidal in the ocean. It's a regular thing, and it's based on the moon. So we could predict that as process as well. So cyclical process is quite unique. Another example that I can give you quickly is coral reef. Coral reef, there are many different species, but the same species will spawn at the exact same time across the world on the exact same day at the same minute, and they would spawn for about 30 minutes, and the reproductive elements have only 30 minutes before they could actually join into an organism. Again, it's a unique moment, and actually some specific fish and others know exactly where to be to take advantage of that process. So, and by the way, the coral reef spawning process is still not well understood how it works. How does coral reef that are halfway around the world know that they have to spawn at the same time? Because that date will change based on the time of the year. It's never the same time every year. And this is, we're getting towards the end of this, some of the ones we want to show. So I think it's one that actually Catherine spoke earlier. I'm not going to go too much in detail, but when you look at use life-running chemistry, which is an interesting one to me, it's like, nature use water-based chemistry. Everything breaks down into benign constituent. If you think about the snake venom is particularly deadly, right? Obviously, it's a toxin that once it's injected into the blood, it would affect the neural system of the animals. That's really what the prey, the snake is able to do. It's the prey that can move, and then at that point, it could swallow it. But while it swallows the prey that receives its own venom, it doesn't affect the snake, right? Because the process is, in the digestion process, it will actually break down the venom, and they actually tested the feces from snakes, and you never find the venom in there, right? So it has this unique process of doing that. So we're looking at similar things, like there's a lot of flame retardant material that we use. If you have a pillow at home, or if you have furniture, depending on where you live around the world, there's different criteria, but they usually they're embedded with flame retardant. And we know that flame retardant are potentially could impact human health because they don't break down very well, especially if you're going to recycle your old couch. Depending on how it's recycled, that could break down into the soil or potentially into the water and gets into the consumption of humans and so on. And we find flame retardant all over the world. It could be in the middle of the Arctic, and you'll find high levels of it in the fish there. So again, an area that humans have to look into on how to do green chemistry. Catherine, do you want to go to this?
Okay, that's mine. Yes, my organism. So for this subgroup, so it's about using readily available materials and energy. And that's exactly what is this tiny planktonic organism is doing by using the free energy from the current to move and to catch its prey. And also by recycling actually the rest of its prey to build a house. So you can see that this house is like a barrel where he can live in, and that will protect him from predators. And actually the female that you see here will lay her eggs inside the barrel and will carry it around to take care of its progeny. So that's quite amazing. And so here you see how these tiny animals are taking advantage of these local resources and energy to live. Overall, nature's resources are limited, and species have to find their own way to fulfill their basic needs with what is available and abundant in nature, in their environment. So some human design are typically aligned with this life principle, like for example, the one that was mentioned in Jacques, to when you harvest the waves or the tide energy to produce electricity. So that's something that you can use. So Jacques, please, the next one. So use feedback loops. So here is a singing bird. So we've been enjoying them during the confinement a lot this spring. And we may wonder why sometimes we hear them singing in the morning and sometimes not. So basically during the day, what they will do, they will look for food and eat as much as possible. And if the night has not been too cold, then they will have enough energy left to sing it loud in the morning. But if the night has been too cold, then the male will not sing because they won't have enough energy. They will have used the energy to regulate their own body temperature. So you see that this bird's responds to night temperature for singing or not. And nature in general runs on information. And the feedback loop that you see here is a response, basically, that is triggered by the information. So the shorter the feedback loop, the easier the response is. And human design that illustrates this life principle is the power bill. So the monthly power bill is the feedback loop that is hard to respond to, actually. But by moving matters inside your house, we shorten the loop, and which results in a 20%, on average, 20% reduction in energy consumption. So the next subgroup, please, Jack. So cultivate cooperating relationship. So for decades, most of the ecologists thought that competition was the driving force of any ecosystem, thinking that basically an ecosystem was organized mostly by individuals. But since the end of the 90s, basically, research has shown that competition, in fact, is extremely rare in nature compared to cooperation, mostly because competition is too costly for individuals. So they will try to avoid competition. By contrast, so cooperation is in fact at the base of life, simply because complexity in life will only arise through cooperation. Cooperation, what is cooperation? Is about so getting a net benefit from a relationship by exchanging different type of resources or services. So there is a ton of cooperation in nature, and here I just presented a glimpse of some of them. So the lichen, for example, it's a combination, it's a symbiosis relationship between mushrooms and algae. Or we've been talking, this example is getting very popular with the mycorrhizae helping, supporting, and with all the plants. So there is a mutual relationship here. And with the the boxer crabs and the sea anemones that you will carry around, or these birds, the jaybird with that will disseminate this acorn, or between the raven and the wolves. And the last one that I presented here is the aphids and the ants. So in all these examples, there is a cooperative relationships and with mutual benefits and an exchange of different kind of services. So in human society, circular economy align very well, perfectly with this life principle, for example. So an eco-industrial park will correspond to a network of cooperative relationship, where the waste from one facility will become the resources for the other facility. So the next slide, please, Jacques. So we so doing chemistry in water. So this we can see the shell of the abalone. So this is covered by an extremely strong nacre made of 90% of a composite called aragonite. And aragonite is basically only carbon dioxide and calcium. So this is, in fact, the arrangement by layers of this aragonite that makes it so resistant, because it's extremely strong. So this strong material is produced by an organism only by using water as a solvent, and with basic element that we saw, so carbon dioxide, calcium, and in normal condition of temperature and pressure. So that's the way nature will do chemistry. So researchers have been trying to emulate this kind of materials. So there is companies that have been created similar materials, very resistant, 10 times more resistant than ceramic. And this is usually this part of the research is part of the green chemistry. And so there is a lot of things to do to learn from nature in that way. So the next one, please, Jacques. Okay, so self-organize. Self-organize, it's part of this group of life principle, which is integrate development with growth. So in nature, so the life principle, this life principle is very clear with social organism, for instance. If there is hierarchy in nature, there will be only 2 levels, but most of the time it is about leaderless community. So there is no leader. And self-organization is about this decentralization of the leadership. So this has to be done by using very simple rules that create at the end an emergent property of the system. So here for these ants, the question is how do they organize to farm food for the whole colony? And we know that they create routes to food by laying down some sand trails. By using the same route, so ants will reinforce the sand trails and they will find the food. So this principle has been used, for instance, in the design of Waze, this application for navigation to support drivers to find the best itinerary and to minimize the traffic. So could you do the next slide, please, Jack? So we presented you 10 key life principles, but remember that there is in total 26, I think, and so 24. So it was to show you how to be applied, to apply them in designing a product, a process, or a solution in biomimicry. So I personally found them very powerful for building sustainability, for helping building sustainability at school. I am an educator and I'm actually organizing some teacher training to help students, teachers and school community reflect on how nature can inspire us. And we know that we have about 10 years to act against climate change. It's a very short deadline. And so we want to make sure to build to make sure that our next generation of bankers, designers, entrepreneurs will have the tools and the mindset for building a more resilient society. So here with this sustainable development goal defined by the UN, so I think that's this is a few of them that really should be considered to prepare youth for the future. And the life principle, our perfect tool to bring consciousness on how the natural world works to perpetuate life and how we should learn from it. So we can learn from this life principle as a mentor to guide us, or model to follow, or measurement to use as an assessment. So the next slide, please, Jacques. So to conclude, we would like you to look at this slide, and it's about relating the life principle to you. And so, as you have seen in the presentation, so there is a whole gradient of use for this life principle. They can be very literal for a specific product, or you can use it in a much more metaphorical way. And here are some elements of reflection on how to apply this life principle in your organization, in your professional life, or in your personal life, actually. So this example are coming from a document from Biomimicry for Social Innovation and the Biomimicry Institute. And it's actually a simple form, but we use it in our workshop or training. So I let you look at it, and maybe you can share some thought about it. Okay,
If that's okay, I'm gonna continue, Catherine.
Yep.
And I want to be respectful of everyone. I know we started a little late, so we have a couple more slides, and then I want to make sure we have a chance to answer some of the Q&A. I've seen a lot of good question on the chat, but certainly this is going to be recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel and on our website. So just quickly, I mean, again, the life principles, we've talked about the main ones and we talk about some of the sub-principles. Again, think of it as either a guide to help you, you know, when you're looking at solving a unique challenge, whether you're designing a product or process or even a system within the organization, you could actually use some of these deep patterns to be part of your design brief. But we also see it very valuable at the end of the process to use it as a checklist. Did I actually accomplish some of these life principles? And we know some of them are very difficult to do, like the chemistry that Catherine was mentioning earlier is one of the most challenging ones because the green chemistry is an area that we're still struggling, but there's great progress moving forward. The material science is still something that we are challenged over time. So we can go into questions. I just want to quickly mention a couple of things. We have another webinar in 2 weeks from one of our advisory board member. We're going to be talking this time about nature teach us about resilient society. So here we're applying nature's knowledge in the context of resilient society. This is really important today because especially where we're experiencing today as a global species, the pandemic that has really push us to rethink how we organize our society and system. And resiliency is something that we obviously could definitely learn from nature. As you learn today that adaptation and the idea of the fitness level is essential for long survival. You could access the website. If you have questions, you can email us directly. We'll have this webinar on the YouTube and on the website as well. And if you want to register for this last webinar series that we have for now, it's through Eventbrite. I'd be happy to let you know. So at this point, I think we want to kind of open it up to questions. And if you have a questions, what I'll ask you, just unmute yourself and ask your question. So we have one from, I wouldn't know how to pronounce you, Sharazad. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. If you want to ask your question or if you want to write your question in the chat, I don't know which is better, but.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad to be with you. Thank you very much again. I am Shahrazad. I'm from Algeria. I'm an architect, architectural designer, and I'm really interested in biomimicry and bio-inspired eco-design. And after 5 years of graduation and doing lots of, can't say a lot, but doing some readings because it's never a lot. And now I'm currently a member of the Creathon of France, the Creathon of France for for biomimicry. It's a creathon for like 30 days with webinars and workshops in order for us to like shape our ideas into a more concrete solutions, hopefully. So my question is, do you what are the, like I'm now searching for a master of philosophy abroad about biomimicry. Do you have this option in for your center offers this option?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. And I know there's a lot of, obviously this organization is based in Switzerland, but obviously we have great friends and partners throughout Europe. France has a lot of great work going on that I'm aware of. They have the center on called CBIOS, and they have an annual conference that I would encourage you to do.
CBIOS, yes, CBIOS.
Yeah. So to your question specifically, at least if you're specifically looking for you know, a PhD in biomimicry, The only one that
I'm really,
go
yeah.
ahead.
I'm really interested, really like this. The one that that fascinates me is the relationship between biomimicry and the divine geometry. I read some like this is lately because before I used to say I'm keen about keen of biomimicry. Sorry, having average English, but when I read about the biomimicry and the relationship with the divine geometry and how that can help the industry and like architecture. So it's really, this is the one I think I want to further my studies for.
That's good. That's good. So it sounds like you find your higher calling. So I mean, there are many schools around the world will offer biomimicry, either part of their curriculum. There are several schools that are have that embedded into their programs, either as their kind of their core classes, whether it's in engineering, architecture, design, and so on. The one school that I'm aware today that I've had colleagues that went through the program is the University of Akron. So this is actually in the US. It's Cleveland, Ohio, who has a PhD program on biomimicry. And it's what's quite interesting with their approach is that once you enter the program, you're actually working with industry. So each PhD candidate that are in the program from the University of Akron will actually work directly with an industry. So I had friends that worked on new materials, some that have worked on things that are more around organization structures. So if you're looking for that kind of level, that's one. Other than that, there are many centers that offer a master's program in different fields. The other option is if you're looking for a non-PhD program, the program that was mentioned by Catherine that I mentioned earlier. A lot of people at Biomimicry Switzerland actually either went through the program in part because there's different levels, but it's the ASU program. Arizona State University has a biocenter that is actually run by Janine's partner and colleague, Dana
Yeah,
Baron.
3.0,
Yeah.
3.8.
So it's from 3.8, but it's actually based in Arizona State University. And
Arizona, yes.
For 2 years.
Can you please repeat the name of the university in Switzerland? I didn't.
So
I don't understand.
the first name, I'll write it in the chat. The first university is based in the US. It's University of Akron.
Akron, that's one. Thank you very much.
And we have a lot of these on the Biomimicry website. If you go to the resource page, we have links to these groups. So
I'm a new member for in Biocon of Germany, and I think Biocon is they're like more democratic when accepting members because CBOS Gilles he's not an architect, he's a doctor. So I think lots of members are more biologically oriented more than engineering. So I couldn't find myself really like I am oriented to design and architecture, and so I think.
Yeah, I think you'll find a lot of organizations that are, Switzerland. Obviously, we're small and nimble, but I'm very familiar with the Germans. There are many groups out there that you could belong to, but feel free to ask us more questions if you have, or email us directly. One of my colleagues will be happy to either connect you with other people or help you. I see there's another question, if I may. So I'm going to go through if you have a question, I'm going to go back to the comments because I haven't seen every single one. So if you have a question, just feel free to speak up. So there's an earlier comment. Yes, nature has survived for billion years. As Janine mentioned, there was a comment that was made earlier. So we're a much younger species. I think we've had that in the introductory. We have a lot to learn from our elders. It is true that this untapped knowledge of 3.8 years of research is sort of what's really at available to us. The reality, though, I want to make sure you understand that going from biology to design and design to engineering is not an easy step, because you have to understand the biology very well. But not only the biology, you have to understand the chemistry and the physics that goes on with these particular questions that we've brought up earlier. So you really have to have a very strong base of science there. I'm looking at the message there. I mean, is there another question? There is an option, a better option available for cement. So we've talked about, yes, so I think that was mentioned by some team member. There is a company in the US called Blue Planet. We did a number of case studies that we talked about this technology, and they're actually using basically the CO2 emission from a power plant and use that as an input to make aggregate materials that is actually used in creating cement. So if you ever travel to the US, the airport, part of the terminal 3, I forgot, at San Francisco airport is made with that concrete. So in a way, you're actually embedded carbon into a structure instead of releasing it to the atmosphere. So interesting approach there. Or the question, why is it not used everywhere? Well, part of it is because it's new. It's a good question. Part of it is because it's new, and it's also because it takes time for this technology to be embraced. You know, there is something to be said about engineering. You could have the most innovative idea that could change things over time. What I've seen and what others of my colleagues have seen when you look at the scientific review, it takes literally 20 years, maybe a little less, but about 20 years for a paradigm shift to happen in engineering, meaning that you can have the most efficient way of filtering water, but if everybody else in industry is using a much older system, they're going to entrust that over something different that is newer. And it's part of it is because corporations, large companies are risk adverse. Not going to invest in technology that is unproven. So a good example of that, there's a company, I'm blanking on the name, based out of Singapore, that created a new system to filter water, ocean water, to make drinkable water. And their technology is more efficient, but because it's so new, the industry is not embracing it yet, or it's a very, very slow process. So part of it is that's the challenge we're having. So that's why we really need potentially government regulation that will inspire companies to take more risk, if you will, or we force them to do that. I want to be respectful of time because we're running kind of way beyond the scheduled time. I'm looking at other questions. I want to thank my colleague Katrin for doing this webinar with me. She did a fantastic job, and I think think about this is a joint effort to do this. So you know, we all come from different backgrounds. I'm not a biologist. She is, as you could probably tell, she could go in much more detail than I have. I'm going to leave you. I mean, feel free to ask us questions. There were another video I was going to show you in a minute, but you know, I want to leave you with this statement from Janine Banius, which really speaks to we need to really rethink that the lens that we're using is maybe has been the wrong one, and we need to use that lens to really explore the natural world. And my personal connection to exploring the natural world is also to have a greater sense of humility for all living species, but also hopefully as designers, and I say designer as a big D, like all of us are designers, whatever skill sets you have in background, that we do this consciously, but also we do this in the mindset that we want to protect the species or the ecosystem where we find that incredible jewel and knowledge that we apply to human challenge. Meaning that we have to go back and make sure we educate people, and that the work that Katrin is doing with her students is essential. We have to teach people not only we can learn from nature, but we have to learn how to protect nature and restore the ecological services so that other generations can use it. So that's going to be my main thing. I have a funny poll if you want to do the poll. I'm launching it right now. You don't have to, but it was just maybe helpful for us to figure out kind of your thoughts on this. And I'm looking at if there's other questions. I have a question. Okay. Oh, say, I have a question. By why isn't used everywhere? Is geoengineering the way to help against? No, so geoengineering is an interesting thing. Geoengineering is, I'm trying to that is an area that I'm a little bit, I'm going back and forth. Geoengineering, it's what, for those that do not know, it's how we could potentially mitigate climate change, right? There's discussion of, as crazy ideas of going out of space and putting like a giant way to potentially like a shield that would kind of push away some of the sun rays. There are ideas to transform the ocean so that they could absorb more carbon. Geoengineering is an interesting thing, but again, is something that humans have to be extremely careful, because if we start using a genius to change the Earth's process, we could do it in situations that if we don't fully understand how it works, it could have other intended consequences, right? So geoengineering or terraforming, what we're trying to do with potentially what we do, or we want to go out of space and like change the conditions on Mars, for instance, they all have potentially unknown consequences out of this process. But it is possible an area. I think climate change in geoengineering could be an area, but I don't know how it's going to work over time. So it's to be defined. Well, I see that other people mimicking the volcano at the base. If you want to speak up and explain what you're trying to do, that's fine. We only have a few more minutes. But I want to thank you everyone for joining. This is obviously something new that we're doing. We hope this was helpful. We're all here and available. If you're interested to join the association, you're welcome to do so. We're a small organization. We are working on very small projects that are usually based in Switzerland and potentially elsewhere in Europe as we find new partners there that we work with. So we have a lot of other colleagues that are doing biomimicry work, whether it's in the Netherlands, Germany, France, Austria. So you'll find many groups of biomimicry regional networks in Europe and actually around the world too. There are, I think, a total of 56 that I'm aware of. So let's look at the result. If you, the people that responded value content, that's really helpful. Nobody was peer pressure, that's good. So you guys are really interested in things like design thinking, living building challenge, and circular economy. Okay, that's very helpful. Is there any final thoughts? And I'm sorry, I'd be happy to have a broader conversation around this mimicking the volcano at the base. If you want to maybe add more to it, that would help me kind of understand what that question is. But there are many ways we could use biomimicry. The one thing I will say to all of you is, we want to be careful that we're not saying that biomimicry is going to solve everything. It's not, right? What we're saying is kind of that looking into nature is another lens, like Janine said, right? It's another way to look at a problem and exploring how natural organisms are doing it, basically. And that's sort of the main idea, is to look at nature as a model, as a mentor, and potentially a source emulation that we can bring in, and bring ourselves as humans towards this role of being more sustainable, and then moving our society to a restorative society where we're able to bring back a lot of these essential elements that we have. Catherine, do you have a final thought you want to share, or something that you want to say to the rest of the group?
I wanted to thank you first, I mean, for this webinar, and thank you for being here. I just wanted to add, yes, I think you mentioned that connection with, for school, I mean, to connect with nature, that's something that is really important, and to spend time outside with kids, it's really something that, and that is really essential.
Yeah, I agree, Catherine. I think, if we could teach the next generation, especially the young minds, on how to think about these from their perspective, and really excite the curiosity to think about biology in that way, and potentially give them the tools and knowledge so that not only they will seek nature as a mentor, but also find ways to protect it over time. So,
yeah.
Yes, I'm looking at the last comment from you. Feel free to email us. We have that. It's info@bswiss. I could put the email address back if you want. So info@bswiss, that's where you can email your, bswiss.ch, you can email your question, be happy to help you address that questions. But at this point, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Sorry we went way over time. Thank you for joining us. I want to thank all my colleagues from Biomimicry Switzerland for being present. Catherine, Jamie, and Marina, and I don't know if Liliana is also on the call, but thank you everyone, and we'll look forward to having you in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you, Catherine.